Terry Foy, CEO of Inside Lacrosse, who is at the airport on his way to go cover the national quarterfinals. Terry, we appreciate the time. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. And let's start right there with what Paulie was alluding to. Do you buy into the notion? I think SU fans are kind of banking on that this week. That it is tough to beat a team 3 times in 1 year. We saw North Carolina win the first 2. How tough is it? I mean, do you buy into that theory that it's tough to beat a team 3 times?
I do, but I actually don't think that it's the most applicable factor here. I actually would put it 3rd or 4th. I think that what's more important if you're a Syracuse fan to be focused on is, I think, 2 things. The first was, I didn't feel like Syracuse went into the ACC tournament feeling like they either needed to win or had anything to prove. And it's not to question their motivation, but it is to say that I think, relatively speaking, Carolina probably had a little bit more of the motivation edge. And then the more important factor is just, a Carolina team without Owen Duffy is much different from a Carolina team with Owen Duffy, and we don't know whether he's going to play. If he does play, I think it's fair to assume he's not going to be at full health. And then the last thing I would add is just Carolina's coming off of a game against Albany that didn't really test them, and perhaps there's a rest advantage situation there, but I am a much bigger believer in the value of the test that Syracuse had when they were taken to the limit by Yale, and I think it's gonna help them in terms of their sharpness coming out of the gate against the Tar Heels.
You brought up Owen Duffy. We had Paul Carcaterra on our show earlier in the week, and he said, bear with me here, and he laid out a scenario where he thinks it might even be better for Syracuse if Owen Duffy were to play, because as you just alluded to, it sounds like he's not going to be anywhere near 100%. And Owen Duffy being the competitor that he is, he thinks that maybe UNC would be more. Would be easier to guard, I guess, and easier to defend if he were out there, as opposed to if he's not out there. He thinks it might make them a little bit tougher to defend. What do you make of that statement, that reasoning?
Kevin Brown from Inside Lacrosse just published what has become one of my favorite features annually over the last 15 years, which is our anonymous scouting report, which is effectively you talk to as many assistant coaches whose teams are eliminated from the playoffs but have played and prepared and scouted these opponents. And one of them made that very same argument. It was less about what Carolina is with a limited Duffy, and it was a little bit more about how there are times when the ball can get sticky in his stick. And he saw a team last week that looked a little bit more free-flowing in terms of its ball movement. So I think you can kind of attack it from both angles, especially because Owen's game is so predicated on explosiveness and athleticism that an injury that might limit somebody else, call it 20%, might limit him 40%. And I don't know that we're necessarily making an optimistic case. I think it's very realistic. And I think that on top of that, one of the things that becomes so fascinating is how it informs how John O'Derna and the rest of the staff will devise their defensive game plan. If all things were equal, you would probably assume, all right, we're gonna stick with the game plan that we've established, but we're gonna tweak around the margins and hope that it works there. In this scenario, I think it's justifiable to say, do we want to switch the matchup? Do we want to take a completely different approach to how we support whoever ends up guarding Owen Duffy? And I think that just a lot of the questions stem from there.
This time of year, goaltending and face-off play are so very important. I don't need to tell you that. And for Syracuse, they've gotten, John Mullen. They got the John Mullen from last week, right? He certainly stepped up his play in recent weeks. And in net, Jimmy McCool was fantastic in the second half. Didn't play great in the first half against Yale, but was phenomenal down the stretch. What do you make of? We know about UNC's face-off situation. They're the best in the country there. What about the goalie situation with the Tar Heels, and what do you make of the change going into the NCAA tournament?
To reference that anonymous scouting report again, the consensus seemed to be that you cannot go back to Josh Marcus at this point. That you've made your decision to go forward with Kent Good, and you kind of have to ride with him. And I say that on the basis of having no other additional information as to whether or not even going back to the freshman is a consideration that they're working through. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that Good is going to get the start again, and then it just comes down to how well he plays. He played well enough in a game in which he wasn't tested against Albany that he certainly didn't play himself out of the situation. So I think that that's reasonable and good to be informed. But at the same time, if you're just straight up and down, picking which goalie you prefer, there's no question it's Jimmy McCool, and I think that's a great source of consolation and solace for Syracuse fans. At the faceoff position, I felt like coming into this season, preseason All-Americans-wise, Brady Wambach was first team, Johnny Mullen was second team. There was no debate about that. And then there was a bit of a chasm to third team and beyond. And so when these two teams were going to play, I was like, oh, this is going to be one of the most exciting kind of puzzle matchups that we're going to get. Johnny didn't have the start to the season such that it was a Clash of the Titans billing going into that game. But I think you're right to point out that he has figured some things out, and I have seen a few. I don't want to call them more cracks, but just elements of Wambach's game that weren't as dominant as they were early in the season. And I think that convergence might end up, pushing this a little bit more toward neutral. I'm not going to go so far as to predict that Syracuse can get to 50% facing off, but I do think that they can get to 40%, maybe even 45%. And the way in which that narrows the gap makes it so much more of a game about whose team's going to be more efficient, whose offense is going to be more efficient in settled 6-on-6 scenarios.
In terms of adjustments that were made from the first meeting to the second meeting, and then adjustments that you expect to be made from the second meeting to the third here, we saw John O'Derna throw some zone at North Carolina in that second game. It really seemed to limit Dom Petramala in that second meeting. Do you think they will go back to that, or because they already threw it at the Tar Heels, do you think now they have to make another adjustment? And if they do, what do you think that adjustment would be on the defensive side of the ball for Syracuse?
Well, like I already said, I think the biggest adjustment stems from, do we want Riley Figueres guarding Owen Duffy? And if we feel like that's not the best deployment of his on-ball matchup, then what do we do? And I think the interesting thing about North Carolina is, they don't have a third attackman that you're particularly concerned about beating you off the dodge. And Dom Petramala is a player who the most important thing about how you guard him is how well you stick onto him. And there are very few players in college lacrosse that know his game better than Billy Dewan. And so for all those reasons, I think it's reasonable that at least from a starting point, you say, all right, well, no, we don't really have a better option than what we've deployed previously. I think the element of the zone that you're talking about is really, in my opinion, difficult to divorce from the fact that they made a goalie change in the first one, right? Usually when you deploy a zone, what you're trying to do is say, we're comfortable with the shots that we're going to give up on the basis of our goalie making the shots that we're comfortable giving up. And so there's an element to that decision in the ACC game that makes me, the ACC tournament game, that makes me wonder whether it was it was meant to be viewed as a vote of confidence for the goalie. And I don't know the extent to which that means it's a repeatable strategy that you're going to continue to deploy. I think that more than we feel like it's the best way to defend them, a lot of times the reason you do it is because it's the best way to disrupt the flow of the game. And one of the interesting things about this is Syracuse is going to, if not need, then certainly benefit more from a couple of goals in transition. And that's not to say that you need both teams to be playing frantically, frenetically, and clearing fast in order to get, presumably, Billy Dewan into those offensive positions. But it does indicate that the odds are better if both teams are playing that way, and that would benefit Syracuse. You don't tend to play fast when you're in a zone. So that would be another argument against it if you felt like it was going to take away some of those transition opportunities. I
do have a couple big picture questions I want to ask you, but before we move on to those, you want to take a stab at a prediction for this game tomorrow?
I picked Syracuse. I picked Syracuse in my bracket. I picked Syracuse to be a Final Four team in the beginning of the season. I think this matchup is very favorable for a lot of the reasons that we just talked about. I don't know that I would have picked them against any of the other three teams that I chose to lose or that I picked to lose in my bracket or this week. So on that basis and for a variety of reasons, I feel like we're going to see Syracuse and Charlottesville.
All right. SU fans love hearing that. Outside of the Syracuse-North Carolina game, what other matchup are you most intrigued by this weekend?
Why is that? Can I say I'm tied for all? Honestly, sure. I don't think there's a delta between any of the four. I think that obviously Syracuse and Carolina's star power is going to be difficult to match, their history and just the aesthetic of the uniforms on the field. But the other three matchups each represent something, particularly appealing. You've got the revenge factor in Princeton, Penn State. You've got the can Hopkins do this? Can they get back to the Final Four hump in the Hopkins Notre Dame game? And then in the fourth matchup, which is currently escaping me because I just got off of a plane. I'm sure there's something really intriguing about that one.
You've got the Notre Dame game. You got Duke Georgetown.
Duke Georgetown.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and in that one, it's the battle there is this Duke team is the team that we hoped or expected they'd be all season long, and Georgetown is Hopkins-esque situation or position of not can we get back, but can we finally get over this hump in the Kevin Warren era.
In terms of who you think wins it all on Memorial Day, I know it could probably be any one of the 8 teams, right? Which just speaks to the parity in the game right now. But who are you picking right now?
So when I came on early in the season, you might remember that I talked about how it's so matchup dependent, and it's not just matchup dependent. It's also who gets the luxury of playing at noon on Saturday. And at this point, it feels like a crutch or a cop-out, but it's just the history is too firm that, can I wait until we find out which matchup ESPN believes is the more prominent one that they're going to put at 2:30 and then pick whichever team I think is better noon matchup to win, because that's basically what I'm going to do.
I love it. And then just lastly, Terry, we saw earlier in the week that SMU has announced that they're in the early stages of potentially, adding men's lacrosse to the sports that it offers. What does that say, I guess, about where college lacrosse is right now? And we hear about the growth of the game all the time, but I would imagine good news for the game. Yes, given the parity in this tournament, given the, another, Power 4 school, and they would be great for the ACC, right? Because then they get an automatic bid in the tournament.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I can answer that question in 2 ways. The first is that SMU is such an outlier in the sense that it's already Title IX compliant and it doesn't require a significant source of funding, and yet it has seemingly endless funding in order to be able to pursue this, plus the motivation of having just joined the ACC and being good neighbors that way. So I don't feel like it's a trend that is likely to be followed in the same way that when Utah added varsity lacrosse, that was not a trend that was followed, and similarly for Michigan. However, we went 30 years between Notre Dame and Michigan with 0 teams in Power 4, I guess now Power 2 or 3 conferences adding men's lacrosse. So to have 3 over the course of 15 years represents really dramatic growth. Now, with that being said, Utah and SMU were not Power 4 conferences when now Power 4 teams when Michigan added lacrosse. So, the window has shifted a little bit, but I think your point is right. The downstream benefits, unlocking varsity lacrosse in Texas is enormous. This almost will certainly trigger bracket expansion to either 20 or 24. So and then, beyond that, the appeal, the coaching carousel, there's just, like I said, so many downstream effects of this prospect that have the ability to really transform the landscape of Division I men's lacrosse, and because that is so close to the pinnacle of sport, the entire sport altogether.
Great stuff, Terry, as always. We'll let you be on your way. I know it's been a long day traveling already for you, but thanks for finding some time for us. We love talking lacrosse with you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Terry Foy, CEO of Inside Lacrosse. We'll hit a timeout here. Yeah,
Does SMU adding a sport make you realize how much money they have?
Right.
While Notre Dame is talking about having to cut sports, SMU's adding.
Yeah, the announcement with Notre Dame was they're cutting baseball in half.
Yeah,
like the amount of scholarships they're giving out. And I mean SMU is, as he just said, they don't have to do it, but they're like, here, let's add another sport.
They're gonna have 10 scholarship players. Like their lineup
for Notre Dame baseball.
Lineup and one and a half pitchers. Yeah, if you gave them full scholarships. So
full lineup and a closer.
Yeah.
There you go. All right, we'll hit our final timeout. We will wrap things up next on ESPN Radio.